Hello everyone. Thank you very much for being here. I'm very happy to introduce Joseph Kabowski, who I've had a great pleasure to know for some time now. So he is David F. and Erin M. Foundation professor at the University of Notre Dame in the US. He's also a fellow at Kellogg Institute and has been long affiliated with the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER. His research is mostly focused on economic growth, development, and international economics, with a special focus on structural transformation. And we all know that Malaysia is at a crossroads of transitioning from upper middle income economy to a higher income economy. So his research provides a great lens to look at how to look at what to expect with this such a structural transformation and what are the challenges of it. And in this lecture series, two-part lecture series today and tomorrow, we'll be looking at how basically what does it mean, and then what are some of the frameworks, as well as some of the application to Malaysia and by extension to East Asia overall. Let me also mention that in addition to these two lecture series, Professor Kabowski will also be giving a research seminar tomorrow morning at 11 a.m., after which we'll have lunch here outside before moving to the second lecture of this series. So please, I very highly encourage you to join us for tomorrow's seminar as well. So without further ado, let me give the floor to Professor Kabowski. Please take it away.
Thank you, Shafa. Thank you all for having me. It's my first time in Malaysia. I've been to Singapore a few times and been to southern Thailand, but this is my first time in Malaysia. So it's very nice to be here. The lecture series is Structural Transformation and Economic Growth. Here I have just the title Structural Transformation, because Structural Transformation and Economic Growth is the name of a research program that Doug Gollin and I run. So I didn't want it to be confuse the lecture with the research program. So let me just start off by this quote from Simon Kuznets, who won the Nobel Prize, and from his 1973 Nobel lecture, to talk about what is structural transformation. And Kuznets and I, we both have a broad view of structural transformation. I'm going to take a little bit during this, but he says the economy is hot. Made structural change. Most research, so he talks about increasing scale, productive establishments, the formalization, things, but most research in structural transformation is focused on this movement across the sectors, chiefly agriculture, industry, services, but increasingly more in thinking about even the mix within those, the industrial mix within those sectors. And the patterns are patterns in labor, in value added, and in consumption or final expenditures. And I mentioned it's also called structural change. We've got much better data on labor and value added than on consumption and final expenditures. So I'll just briefly touch on consumption and final expenditures in these lectures. Most of it will be focused on labor and value added. So this is the plan for the lectures, and I've included three. There's today's lecture, there's tomorrow's lecture, and then in between I'm giving a seminar, which is also going to be on structural transformation. So they're all sort of going to be independently, related, but talking about different aspects. So today I want to focus on understanding structural change patterns, what we know as a discipline about structural change patterns, and what are the implications of structural change for growth. Tomorrow, the growth implications in many ways are going to be disappointing, given the existing theories that we have. So tomorrow, I'm going to present some new research that kind of marries structural transformation and growth in a more interesting way by linking it to capital accumulation. If we want to understand particularly the industrialization and growth process, you really have to understand capital accumulation as being linked to structural transformation and growth. So that'll be the seminar tomorrow. And then the second lecture tomorrow, whereas this is going to be much more positive, this will be more normative. So thinking about some of the structural change patterns, a little bit working in a bit more policy. This first lecture is just going to be sort of nuts and bolts. And then the second lecture, we'll think about more policy implications. Okay. By the way, Shafat, is it interactive or is it just going to be a one-way lecture? Curious.
Yeah, it could be interactive, so
Okay.
please.
Because I'm happy for people to ask questions. I actually don't know the timing of these lectures either. I give something related, but this is the first time I'm giving this lecture. I may have too much material prepared, I may have too little, but we'll make it up in the second lecture. So this is the plan for the lecture. I don't always stick to plan. So I mentioned this already, and I wanted to touch on it, which is there is this new research program that I hope you would all know about and potentially be participating in, called Structural Transformation and Economic Growth. It's a poor acronym, but the STEG is the acronym. And it is a research program funded by, well, this is old. It's not DFID funded anymore. I should have replaced that. DFID was replaced by FCDO. But this is basically UK foreign aid funded. And it's run by CEPR out of London. And Doug Gollan and I are the academic leads. Doug is a friend at Oxford. And what does it mean to be a research program? So first, what are we focusing on? Understanding ways to industrialize, increase productivity, and grow inclusively. The focus, however, is not on countries like Malaysia that are transitioning from upper middle income countries to high income countries, but on low income countries. And focusing on research, academic research, but what has policy implications for guiding low income countries. Does that mean that we can't fund any research on Malaysia? No. I think you're not going to learn about structural transformation by only focusing on the countries that haven't really undergone it. So Malaysia, as a success story, may have much to tell. But if you're going to apply for grants or submit papers, there needs to be a relevance. There needs to be a clear relevance between the research on Malaysia and what we can learn for low-income countries, chiefly in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia. So it's structural transformation, economic growth. I would say the questions are macroeconomic questions, but methodologically, and substantively, it's a very broad research program. So we have people running anything from doing RCTs to empirical industrial studies, many different things to focus on. You go to the website, you'll get more information about this. The partners are Notre Dame, where I teach, and then this big lab, which we've just started, and BIG stands for Building Inclusive Growth. So again, it's related to the center's goals here. ASSET, Oxford, I mentioned again, ASSET, which is a think tank in Ghana, a policy think tank in Ghana, the Groening Institute, and YRISE, it's at Yale University. $12 million over 5 years. We anticipate it being renewed, so it'll be a continuing program with more money. So we have money to give for grants. We have conferences that we organize. We even have mini courses that we've organized. So please get involved. We started in 2020. We've had continuing calls for grant proposals. They feel like they're just rolling all the time, conferences, lectures. This year, we organized and gave a course at the IMF as well on structural transformation and inclusive growth. So this is nice to give this year at the World Bank as well. So I want to just start with some data patterns to give you a sense of structural transformation. Now, I mentioned we can think about this in terms of employment. We can think about it in value added. We can think about it in terms of consumption. This is, I believe this is from the Herendorf et al. Handbook chapter on structural transformation. Bertolt actually was a great researcher in this area, a good friend and a collaborator on the IMF. Of course, he passed away suddenly this year. But to the research, you see here that the share of agriculture in employment declines with development, and as a measure of development, we're going to use the log of GDP per capita. The share of services increases with development, and then manufacturing shows this hump shape of increasing a process of industrialization and then deindustrialization. When we look at value added, we see very similar patterns with some differences. The first is that there's always more people engaged as a fraction of employment in agriculture than its share of value added in low-income countries. And that's because agriculture is a low productivity sector in low-income countries. We'll focus on that in tomorrow's lecture. The hump shape shows up in either employment or in value added. And then in services, when you look at value added, there's more of an acceleration here, kind of a flatter portion. It's always increasing, but this is sort of linearly increasing. This at high incomes kind of accelerates, higher and higher share of value added. And these are for advanced economies. I'm showing these patterns. These are for a broader set of countries, showing you similarly, but using more recent data and a broader set of countries. And again, you see this kind of increase, this decrease. Every pattern that I showed you in the earlier data is evident in these data as well. There's this hump shape. There's this acceleration in the services value added share and an increasing and decreasing in agriculture. And obviously at the low income levels, the share of workers is much higher than the share of value added. Okay. This is across a much wider range of countries. This is using cross-sectional data from 3 different time periods, 1980, 1990, and 2000. But nonetheless, you see that these patterns still show up. This is all in employment, and the patterns are very similar. So I think one of the things to come out of the data is that these patterns are common. They are common development patterns across countries, and yet they're not all in a straight line. So there's heterogeneity. So I think you always want to think about what's the specifics of a country. Singapore, I was just in Singapore. Singapore is obviously an unusual city-state. It's never going to have a huge agricultural, it's going to have a much smaller agricultural share than ordinary and probably much more involved in trade than a country like the United States, for example. Here is using value added, and here what we're doing is showing sort of these predicted patterns. And so again, you see sort of that these patterns are they're there, but there's a variation in these patterns around sort of the averages. This is, I mentioned we have much less data on consumption. This is the United Kingdom and the United States. And you have to replace agriculture with food. That's a bad replacement, actually, because the agricultural value added in food is a very small share. So but if you look in the final expenditures, you still see this decline in the share of consumption that's in food, this sort of hump shape on manufactured goods, and then the increase in services. So you still see the pattern. They're harder to measure.
And if I was to break up services into tradable and non-tradable, would you see these patterns still, or you'd only see them for non-tradable services if I think about let's say, low or middle income countries?
So it's tradable and non-tradable I mean, I guess all of these things have a little bit of an assignment issue. I should mention what's in services. So it's better to say what's not in services. Agriculture tends to be, that's the cleanest one. That's agricultural, that is my
Sorry, we're just fixing some
poorly mic'd.
live streaming.
Oh. Should I wait or keep going?
You can just keep going. It's done already.
Okay. Agriculture, forestry, and fishing is put into agriculture. What's put into industry? Manufacturing, mining, construction. And the rest is services, which includes a lot of different things. Sometimes people take government out. Sometimes people keep government in. So if you consider tradables to be agriculture and industry, that's not exactly perfect because construction is usually not thought of as a tradable and construction's in industry. And then, but if you do that, obviously there is a pattern between tradables and non-tradables because the non-tradables are by definition the services, and the service sector is growing over time. On the other hand, within the composition of services, some services are very tradable. Business services are tradable. Transportation is in part tradable. So many services are tradable. They tend to look a lot more like in terms of the size of the establishments, they tend to be much larger, et cetera. So it's kind of murky. Because these are often the ones, those tradable services are often the ones that are growing the fastest in rich countries.
In value-added terms.
In terms of value-added terms, that's right. Yeah. Okay, here's some more of the consumption data. Again, things get a little bit messy. It's a little bit harder to see this hump shape and more seems flat. This is what the manufacturing, that hump shape, what we know about that is that a lot of that hump shape, and this will be part of my lecture tomorrow, my seminar, is driven by investment dynamics. That investment goods tend to be much more intensive in industrial sector. And so when you get a boom of investment, that kind of creates some of the hump shape in manufacturing. All right. Here's some stuff on Malaysia. And this is using more recent data that's available. The diamonds are the value added in these three sectors. And the triangles are the employment. And I guess, this is 1970, this is 1975. I think. You see here this gap between the value added in agriculture and the share of workers in agriculture, which is common, like other countries have over time. You see the declines in both the value added in agriculture, both the employment in agriculture and the value added in agriculture. You see less of the hump shape. You see sort of an increase in industry, maybe a slight decline in the employment of industry. And then, but the value added share kind of keeps going up. And then in services, you actually see a little bit of a flattening out in services. So that's what the data looks like. Question is sort of how does this look relative to other countries? And I'm going to, this next slide is going to show you. So here, what we have is this is the Groningen's 10-sector database that I use to construct these data. Can you see the decline in agriculture as income per capita grows? And that's usually the normalization that we use. And you see that at every level of income per capita, Malaysia is pretty high in terms of the agricultural share in output. So it's in some ways it's attaining a high level of income per capita, even though it has a fair fraction of its output in agriculture. How to normatively assess that, at this point, I'm just pointing this out as an observation. Here's the employment share. The employment share, again, the Malaysia is the triangles. It's much more in the center of the data in terms of employment share. So although it seems to have somewhat of more workers at low level, it had more workers than output and low levels of income, not as extreme as in other countries. So here's the industry, and you see the hump shape in the data, and then you see the sort of lack of a hump shape in the in Malaysia. So one of the things I'll talk about tomorrow is premature deindustrialization, and there doesn't seem to be anything, any evidence of that in Malaysia, in the sense that Malaysia is now kind of at a high level of industrial value added, given its income level relative to other countries.
But you would reach the same conclusion if you would look at employment shares in industry rather than value-added industry in terms of thinking about how Malaysia progresses?
That's this. And you wouldn't. Again, and in terms of value-added shares, both in agriculture and in industry, there seems to be something unusual about Malaysia relative to other countries. But when it comes to employment, it seems to be in the middle of the, by the way, again, this is all just positive. I'm not making any normative statements at this point, yeah.
I'm just wondering what these other countries are. Are they countries in the same region or same?
This is across the world.
Just across
So
the
this is the whole set of data that we have, which is, it's not comprehensive, but it's a fairly representative share of the data. It's a GGDC, Groningen Growth Development Center's 10-sector database.
Thank you.
And Groningen is one of our partners in STEG, as I mentioned. What they're trying to do is expand. I would say where it's underrepresented, the data sets, is where data is generally underrepresented, which is low-income countries, sub-Saharan Africa, you have fewer. In terms of a fraction of the global output and the global population, it represents a lot because African countries tend to be smaller, and they're obviously much less of the overall GDP. All right. And then here's the services value added share. And again, Malaysia is a bit of an outlier in the sense of a very low service, very high industrial share, but it's got to come from somewhere. These add up to 1, and there's very low service share for its level of development. And then it's actually kind of declining here, which is unusual. But then when we go back, when we look at the employment shares, it's kind of in the middle of the data again. So we'll come back to this later in the class, but I just wanted to sort of point these things out. Okay. When do I go to?
Sorry?
When do I go to?
3:30. 1 hour more.
Okay. All right. Boy, I've already gone through a lot. I mean, I've gone through a lot of time and not a lot of stuff. I'm looking at the clock. Okay. So why do we care about structural change? I think there's a bunch of reasons to care about structural change. We went to graduate school. At least when I started graduate school, you learned the neoclassical growth model, and there's no structural change in the neoclassical growth model. There's just a representative agent. There's no sectors. So why, in some sense, this is a sales pitch for people that say, I'm a macroeconomist. I'm fine with one sector in the economy. Why do I need to think about 3 sectors? So several possible reasons. One is structural change is associated with dramatic effects on society. I think one of the criticisms of economists is that we are like a little bit opaque to what's actually happening in people's lives, but it disrupts communities. It's a complete change in the style of living. The movement from agriculture to industry is, agrarian societies existed for thousands of years, and that, in a couple of decades, in a place like Malaysia or Thailand, was transformed completely. The whole structure of the way a society is organized. It's also related to other things that we do care about typically as economists, like the female labor force participation, family life, fertility, etc. A second reason is that structural transformation may affect and interact with economic growth. And a third reason is that it may affect inequality, may affect factor shares. A fourth reason is that it may amplify or lessen misallocation of resources, which is related to aggregate productivity levels. And then a fifth reason is that it may interact with trade, business cycles, etc. So to the extent that certain sectors are more tradable, that's going to have potentially important ramifications. For these lectures, today, I want to think about its relationship with aggregate economic growth and its relationship with misallocation. In tomorrow's lecture, I'll talk a little bit more about inequality and factor shares. I really won't talk about business cycles. I don't have much expertise in that. And this is just, I think, something to keep in mind, but we won't emphasize that either. Okay. What are some, then I want to connect the things a little bit to policy, because this lecture is not going to have a ton of policy. But what are some policies to keep in mind that are relevant for structural transformation? Each of these policies that I list can influence efficiency, they can influence growth, and they can influence inequality in principle, which I think are the three sort of normative things that economists usually take into consideration. One thing that can influence structural transformation is the level of integration in an economy. If you're not integrated in an economy, you're typically engaged in agriculture because it's the most, you need food to survive. So if you're not going to be trading with anybody, if you're subsistence, you're going to be in subsistence farming. Nobody's a subsistence doctor. But integration is related to both externally through trade policy and capital flows. If you're a net exporter of manufacturing goods, like many of the East Asian countries have been. And also internally in policies like infrastructure. So integrating people within a country. I think Malaysia is probably beyond a lot of these things. My guess is, I don't know a ton about Malaysia, by the way. But I think a lot of the levels of inclusion in Malaysia are probably more ethnic divisions, and then also probably the East-West, but I could be wrong on that. But in a lot of countries, you have sort of the capital city highly developed, but hinterlands that are not so integrated, so lower income countries. Secondly is subsidies and taxes. So removing distortions. And all the standard models that I'm going to present today are models where structural transformation, the welfare theorems hold. So structural transformation is efficient, so the only thing that can be happening is things can be distorting you away from an efficient allocation. So you can be thinking about removing distortions. Thinking about efficiency, you could have models where the market isn't efficient. And so then you might want to engage in industrial policy that helps take advantage of externalities or something like that, spillovers. And then finally, formalizing small-scale producers is a big policy thing for government revenue and getting small-scale producers access to finance and these types of things. So issues of formalization are also related to structural transformation. Those tend to be much more disproportionately subsistence agriculture and very small-scale services. Human capital is going to be closely connected with structural transformation, especially schooling, and then financial development. So the large-scale tradable sectors, the tradable sectors tend to be large-scale, whether they're in manufacturing or in services and agricultural, I guess, as well, all of which makes them a little bit more financially dependent So financial developments and other policy, relevant policy. So the presentation is going to draw upon several papers today, which is a paper I wrote with my co-author Paco many years ago, and then some of these older works that were trying to understand the relationship between balanced growth that we see in the aggregate, or we think we see in the aggregate, and structural transformation. And then some more recent developments in terms of trying to fit the data a bit more. Okay. So again, now I'm a third of the way through, I'll give you the outline. I want to talk about this balanced growth and structural change, talk about some puzzles, some unsatisfying solutions, some of the aggregate implications of these theories. And then I'm going to talk about today is fitting the data, some difficulties in fitting the data, and some advances. And then normative policy and concerns will be most of the next lecture. Okay. New patterns in the data, I'll have new patterns in the data next lecture as well, but we'll get in a little bit more about breaking out sectors a bit. Okay, so this is the first thing, I was an engineer before I became an economist. And this is the first thing I learned in macroeconomics, which is Caldor's stylized facts, which you're probably all aware of, but we'll go through them. I don't know if anybody ever went back and read Caldor's paper. Caldor's stylized facts are just kind of stated. They're more like Caldor's assertions. And then there's a couple footnotes for England that this was the case. But these are what the statements are. Output per worker grows at a constant rate. Capital per worker grows at a constant rate. Returns on capital are constant. The capital output ratio is constant. That implies that not only do capital and output worker grow at a constant rate, but they're growing at the exact same rate. Keep capital output ratio constant. Capital and labor shares are constant. Obviously, we know that there's been a global increase in capital share and decline in labor share. And then there's wide variation in growth rates of different countries. Now, I'm going to present the paper tomorrow that's going to tell you that these, when you look at the wide swath of development process, some of these are just flat wrong. But anyway, this is the starting point. And so this is the starting point of the literature, which is to say we see huge shifts in the structure of an economy at the same time that we see sort of relative stability in many of these macro aggregates. And so how do you reconcile them? And that's the kind of question that a lot of these papers have gone to address. There's basically two classic theories to explain sectoral reallocation. There is a preferences-driven demand story, what puts in non-homothetic preferences and says agriculture is a necessity good, services are a luxury good. As you get richer, you spend less on food, you spend more on services. Kind of left out the hump shape in the industry, and that's a little bit of an issue in this, but that's the preference-driven story. And then there is the technology-driven, or the supply side, which says that sectors differ in their productivity growth rates. Agriculture has very high productivity growth. Services has slow productivity growth. And the elasticity of substitution is less than 1. So as agriculture grows faster and faster in its productivity, the good gets cheaper and cheaper. But because the elasticity of substitution is less than 1, you don't substitute toward it very rapidly. So the price drops more than at a faster rate than you buy more of it, and the share of agriculture falls. And the opposite happens with services. Services become more and more expensive because their productivity growth is slow in services, and you don't substitute away from it fast enough so that the share rises. Does that make sense? Okay. With any productivity story.
So can I ask you just maybe a big picture question just at this point maybe? So if I think about, so let's say when you think about, like you said, right now you're just presenting a positive picture of how the world has looked like, right?
Yep.
If you think about the role of agriculture in the economy per se, when we think about structural transformation, so is the general thinking that, agriculture can never be the focus primarily because of the preference demand story, because, there's going to be a natural cap on how much agriculture goods are going to be demanded. If I think about structural transformation being reallocation of capital and labor to the most productive sectors, and if agriculture could now have the potential to become more and more and more productive, does it necessarily always have to have a decline in the share of value added? Is this principally coming because demand can never grow as fast as the country is going to grow because, it's a necessary good and we'll never want to consume more of it?
That's a good depiction of what's going on. I say this is a preference story. But this is also a preference story because you got to have this elasticity of substitution less than one. Mm-hmm. So preferences are tied in both. There is one exception to this that I haven't explained yet, which may be more relevant for small open economies, which is that in an open economy, what you consume doesn't have to be related to what you produce. So a very small country could, if their productivity in agriculture increases, they could sell all, they could become highly agrarian. Mm-hmm. That doesn't really happen very often. Typically, it's poor countries that are not very integrated, who have most of their resources in agriculture. I don't know if I can even think of an exception to the rule, but in principle, that could happen. So there's always this elasticity of substitution less than one comes from the closed economy, preferences in a closed economy. If the country's a small open economy, in fact, the elasticity of substitution is infinite. You just produce whatever's, like think of a Ricardian model or something. Okay, so these are sort of the stories of structural transformation. I want to go through these papers and think about these attempts at solving this apparent balanced growth with structural transformation. The first puzzle is in the non-homotheticity. So you have an Euler equation that comes out of most dynamic macro models that says that the marginal utility of consumption today ought to be equal to the interest that I would get, the value of consuming today is the discounted value of consuming tomorrow, accounting for the fact that I earn interest if I save. Standard preferences, which are CIES, constant intertemporal elasticity of substitution, imply constant growth. So if you have a constant growth rate in consumption, so now I just take the marginal utility of this, you get C to the minus theta here, C plus 1 to the minus theta here, put those over here, solve, you get the growth rate of consumption is a function of the discount factor and the interest rate. So if the interest rate is constant, which it is in Caldor stylized facts, the growth rate will be constant. That's how we get constant growth. But when you put a non-homotheticity in, and this is, you put in a subsistence requirement into preferences. Now, you just solve the same thing, and there's a constant growth rate in sort of the surplus consumption, but that's different than the actual consumption. And so you get let's get to think about this. Which way does it go? I think you get predictions for an increasing growth rate, right? If these are constant, yeah. No, you get predictions for a decreasing growth. I can't remember. Increasing growth rate. Okay, but that's a puzzle. Because once if you go use this preference story for structural transformation, you're going to kind of break away from these type of preferences, and you're going to get time-varying growth out of it. So that's one puzzle. Another puzzle is think of the model, the supply or the technology side of the model, where things grow at a different rate. So now we have here a CES aggregator over two intermediates. Let's say this is agriculture and non-agriculture. And epsilon's elasticity of substitution. And then gamma 1T is the productivity growth rate in agriculture. Gamma 2T is a productivity growth rate in non-agriculture. Well, I guess I have it the other way. This is non-agriculture, this is agriculture. Because I want gamma 2 to be faster than gamma 1. So you have a fast-growing sector and a slow-growing sector. And now I want to say this elasticity of substitution is less than 1. What happens is the resources get caught up in the slow-growing sector. Remember, services is slow-growing. More and more labor goes into services, becomes a higher and higher share of the economy. Fast-growing sectors, agriculture, becomes a smaller and smaller share of the economy. What's that going to do? The fastest-growing sector is shrinking, and the slow-growing sector is getting bigger. That's going to tell you should have a declining growth rate over time. This is called Baumol's disease, which is the idea that the slowest growth sector sucks up the resources and drags the economy down. So it leads to declining growth rates. And think about healthcare, for example, in the United States. This is for my American students. Okay, here's the third puzzle. Think about a difference in the factor shares across sectors. So here I've got a Cobb-Douglas production function for sector I, but capital share is specific to sector I. Okay? And think about a capital-intensive sector and a more labor-intensive sector. One of the ways that a sector can be fast-growing is if it's capital-intensive and you accumulate capital. Accumulating capital is going to lead to more productivity growth in a capital-intensive sector than in a labor-intensive sector. Let's have Z be the share of output that's produced in sector 1. Let's have this be capital share, capital payments over output. And so the share of capital can get broken up to capital payments in sector 1 and capital payments in sector 2, and the output in sector 1 and the output in sector 2. And then we can take that and divide it up even more to show that capital share is going to be a sector share weighted average of the capital share in the two sectors. So as resources, say, transition from sector 2 to sector 1, I guess I have this wrong here. Yeah, this should be the other way. Sector 2 grows faster. Capital share is going to decline. Okay? So we have this Caldor stylized fact about how can capital share be constant if what's driving it is capital accumulation and differences in capital share. So these are kind of three challenges that make it difficult to reconcile Caldor stylized facts with structural transformation. So what we do in this paper is we consider a combined framework. These papers, Kongsamut, Rebel O'Shea, and Guy Pissarides, and Asamoah and Guerreri. Of these three, I would say that the Guy Pissarides paper is by far the most influential. But each of these, we're kind of going after the same question, which is how do we get balanced growth with structural transformation? Our paper, which is not as influential as these other papers, ours is more of just a composite. What we did is sort of worked in these theories into a single framework. We use as non-homotheticities what are called generalized Stone-Geary preferences. That's what Kongsamut, Rebello, and Shea use in their preference story. In Guy and Pissarides have the biased productivity story. And so we work in their biased productivity. And then Asamoah and Guerreri have the capital deepening story with the different capital shares. And so we think about, we can consider that as well. Let me introduce each of these. Here's the non-homothetic preferences. You have aggregate consumption, C tilde, which is a summation of the consumption in agriculture, the consumption in, M stands for manufacturing, but that's industry, and S is services. And you have this subsistence requirement. What you're going to actually have in the, so that's the preferences, non-homothetic preferences. You can write out the consumer's problem is to maximize this by choosing the composition of your consumption over time, choosing your capital, where you have a very typical capital accumulation, dynamic capital accumulation question. And the consumer, a representative consumer spends on the different consumption goods and invests, having capital income and labor income. Okay, so a very standard setup. In this world, optimality is going to be, it's a CES production function in the excess consumption in sector I beyond the necessity good, and the excess consumption in sector J beyond the necessity good. And it's going to respond to relative prices. So as a price gets more expensive, you substitute away, but elasticity substitution is going to be low, so you're not going to substitute that much. And then this becomes the Euler equation, which is much more complicated. If you want to get constant growth out of the Euler equation, what are you going to have to get? You're going to have that the rental rate is constant and that the price of manufacturing is constant. And you're going to have that CM equals 0, because for the reasons I gave before, if you have this constant in there, it's going to make growth time varying. So those are things you automatically can see that you need. Okay, I'm going to go to the Consummate, Rebello, and Shea story. Their story is demand-driven. So what they say is these relative prices are going to be constant. Every sector grows at the same rate. We don't have any biased productivity, so the prices stay constant. The relative prices stay constant. By the intertemporal first order condition, the growth is going to be constant. What they're going to need, however, is to deal with this non-homotheticity issue. So what they say is, okay, let's have there be a consumption need in agriculture. There's a subsistence requirement, a certain amount of agricultural goods that you have to consume. That means CA is positive. Let's say that there's an endowment of services that everybody has. So it's the opposite of a need. And that makes services a luxury. So and then we're going to insist that there's no endowment in it. Manufacturing, which is going to be helpful for this reason of getting this constant growth here. Okay? Then in the second assumption, which is a very odd assumption, they need that the value of the need for agriculture is exactly equal to the value of what you're endowed with in services, so that in some sense you have no net need or no net endowment, because the net need or net endowment is going to change the growth rate over time. But this is a very knife-edge assumption. It requires that the relative prices are constant, because these are preference terms, they have to be constant. Moreover, it's a cross restriction on technology that determines the relative prices and preferences. It has to be, this is just a very, it would be like a miraculous state of affairs for this to be equal. But what that does is that just makes the consumption in terms of actual goods, the budget constraint, in terms of the actual goods consumed, being exactly the same as the budget in terms of surplus goods consumed. And so you don't get this kind of growth either accelerating or slowing down based on having a necessity or a luxury. Okay, that's their story. What are some issues with this? This is an unsatisfying solution for what do they get out of this? They're going to get that labor consumption and output are going to go slower in agriculture and faster in services. So you're going to get the structural transformation. They're going to get constant caldera growth. I mentioned how they get it. There's no net subsistence requirement or endowment in the budget. What are some caveats? It's going to predict a flat manufacturing share. It's not going to get this hump shape in manufacturing. It's going to predict an early growth in services because these little constants matter at very low levels of income. But as these go to infinity, these constants become kind of negligible. So for a rich country, they don't matter very much. So if you remember, what we had was agriculture falling very rapidly, but services sort of accelerating late. What they're going to get is, they're going to get, instead of like a, I'll do this for you guys, instead of a sort of a concave growth in services, they're going to get agriculture falling and services, rising like that, and manufacturing completely flat. All right. It's going to require counterfactually flat relative prices. The data shows that the relative price movements are pretty predictable over development. And I mentioned that it needs this cross restriction on technology and preferences. Okay, so that's the first solution. Second solution is in Ian Pissarides. Theirs is a biased productivity story, so I have to introduce some production. So let's say that there's output in sector I, it's Cobb-Douglas. We can have factor shares differ. We can have the productivity growth rates differ. And then we have a firm's problem, where a firm takes output, maximizes the value of output, minus its capital costs, minus its labor costs. Now, I've introduced a few things here. One is, I've introduced a human capital term. So we could put HILI in here. I should have done that. And I've introduced a couple distortions. There could be some distortions to hiring like a tax or something like that, to hiring labor or to hiring capital. So these tau i's and tau k's are any friction or wedge in using inputs in that sector. I'll show you some results. I've made this in a general framework where the capital share could differ across sectors. But things work out very nicely mathematically if you assume that these sectors are kind of the same. And by the way, there's not a huge difference in capital share across these sectors. If there's capital share, what you get is linear production possibility frontiers. Because capital and labor are always used in the exact same ratio, no matter what sector they're used in. Both sectors have constant returns to scale. So it's just always a constant trade-off between the two sectors. And what you're going to get in that world is that the relative prices of two sectors are an inverse function of their relative productivities, and then a potential function of these relative distortions. Relative prices across sectors are going to reflect productivity. If you're very productive in a sector, the price is going to be low, and these distortions. Since we're going to assume that workers can choose either sector, and capital can go to any sector, R&W are constant across sectors, you get this, again, this sort of, that the ratios of these sectors are, of the inputs used are related to these distortions only. Okay? If we're going to say that the distortions in sectors are not sector specific, then what we get is that the share of output in sector I is going to be exactly equal because they're used in the same proportions as the share of labor employed in sector I. And that's, call that FI, okay? This is related to those pictures. Remember, I had value-added shares and I had employment shares. If you say both, all the sectors use labor in the same proportions, you're going to get that those have to be equal. If you say that they use human capital in the same proportions as well, then you can get that the value added share, the fraction of value added in a sector is exactly equal to the fraction of labor used in that sector. And also the fraction of capital used in that sector, because it's all in exact same proportions. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's a little bit of a benchmark to think about. Horrible. Differences. I can translate this for you. I don't know how that happened, but in this world, differences between the labor allocation and the value added shares and labor shares are going to reflect one of two things. Distortions, the towns, distortions to using resources in a sector, selling the output of a sector, or they're going to reflect differences in human capital. So let's look a little bit, hopefully this is the only line that's, now I'm a little bit worried for the rest of the talk. We'll see. We'll go back to the data that we had before. So what I want to do now is take the value added measure and divide by the labor measure. Remember, when you're poor, you have more workers in agriculture. You might have 80% of your workers in agriculture, but they only make 50% of the output. So I'm going to divide the output shares by the employment shares to get your relative sectoral productivity. How productive is this sector relative to average productivity in the economy? That's what I've plotted here. And here you have for industry, services, and for agriculture over time. What you see is that industrial productivity, relative productivity has kind of declined. Agricultural productivity kind of increased for a while. Services is kind of right in the middle. That's very typical. Certainly agriculture being lowest. But what you often see more is like a convergence like this, that these converge over time. Now, remember that these could reflect distortions. So to the extent that they reflect distortions, this could be a misallocation of resources. You have, for some reason, too many resources in agriculture, even though it's low productivity. There's many reasons for this, but thinking of it as an aggregate, there could be a misallocation. It could also be that these people are the most educated, and so they're the most productive per worker. And the people in agriculture are the least educated, so they're the least educated per worker. And then this is kind of interesting about Malaysia, which is that there seems to be this divergence, that industry starts increasing in its relative productivity. This might be concerning. Oh, I'm really worried. Okay, okay. Service relative productivity starts falling. That's also a surprise. That's unusual, I would say. Could be that this is related to mining. I didn't see much when I looked into mining, though. I do know that the share of mining in the economy goes up in the 2000s, which, I mean, I'm linking it to oil, right? But, okay.
I mean,
Augustin? Oh.
yeah, I just wanted to say, can it be related to the fact that, because we do know in manufacturing, most of the firms are open to global competition.
What?
Services are open to global competition.
Yeah, so this could also be due to globalization. I think for sure that the fact that so many East Asian countries maintain a much higher industrial share relative to other countries over time has to do with international trade. Whether it's related to the competition in the service sector, I'm not, I mean, you guys know more about about Malaysia for me.
That was going to be my second point, because services trade restriction index in Malaysia is one of the highest. It has a very high index of
So
restriction.
the only thing there is that to the extent that it's foreign companies coming in, that it's non-tradable services, that's going to still show up in terms of value added and in terms of labor, unless what happens is, like foreign banks come in, they're much more automated, they don't need nearly as many people, then you could, you affect the labor or something like that. But that's, and these could be issues. I'm not an expert in Malaysia, so I apologize for that. But let's see how Malaysia's, go ahead.
Yeah, my question.
Oh, yeah, I forgot about Augustine. I was supposed to call you, yeah.
My question is more on the role of economic crisis, how they affect the structural transformation. Because by looking at that picture, like in '98, we have the Asian financial crisis here, and I mean, we don't see that in the picture, but
No.
I'm wondering how this look like after the global financial crisis, and especially now, like after post-COVID, like how these shocks affect this structural transformation.
Yeah. I don't know much about, I know a lot about the Thai financial crisis, much less about Malaysia's role. I mean, a Thai financial crisis, investment, construction collapsed after that. Finance collapsed after I don't know if that was similar here, but that could have structural transformation implications for sure. But you see, I mean, this is, when it comes to Thailand at least, Thailand is growing at a super high rate. The financial crisis hits, they drop down, and then they just keep growing at a really high rate. And so to have sort of effects many years later, I think that's probably not due to the financial crisis. That would be my guess for Thailand, at least, which I know better.
But I guess it also depends on the shock, right? Because thinking, for example, now thinking about COVID, right?
Yep.
Like this induced like a recession, but also I can think about many channels in which like allocation of labor is changing.
Yeah, for sure.
Changing, right?
Lots of different changes, sure.
But I guess that the effect of crisis on this is completely different and depends on the crisis by itself.
No, I meant to say that there's a big, a huge drop in investment that happens in the crisis, tied with both a lack of financing and, like a real estate crash that happens. That investment was not super long-lived in Thailand. Growth picks up, quickly, and so now, 10, 15 years later. Now this isn't 10, 15 years later. This is going up to 2005, so that's like 7 years later. And I don't have more recent data. This is, this was easy data to download and prepare for the times. Here's this relative to other countries. You can kind of see that this, in development, there's this, trend up, especially at higher income levels. But again, agricultural productivity is relatively high in Malaysia compared to its counterparts at comparable income levels. Industry is kind of common, and this uptick is a little bit unusual. Maybe that is related to the, I don't know, it was hard for me to think of an uptick in the relative productivity of industry. But unless it has something to do again with construction activity. And then you see this services, and one thing and this is probably good from a efficiency standpoint, is that Malaysia doesn't sort of stands out in the sense that many countries at low levels of income have services being a high productivity sector. And it doesn't seem to be the case in Malaysia. again, it's kind of surprising that it's now dropping down below 1, that it's like a relatively low productivity sector. Trying to think again, is it, now I'm trying to think everything through the financial crisis lens, which I hadn't thought of earlier. But I think 7 years later, I mean, in Thailand, there was a ton of people that get it, that when the economy collapses, you just have to become a subsistence entrepreneur, often in services. But that's not a 7-year lasting kind of phenomenon. It's much more of a 2 years type of, 3 years type of thing. Any questions on it? Yeah.
Just more of a few slides ago about the convergence from the relative, yeah, this one. So what can we infer from the convergence itself? Or is there anything that we can infer from the convergence and then the divergence?
So I'll show you some pictures, I think, for the United States. You see some convergence over time. And what that convergence reflects is a couple of things. One is it reflects, like I said, part of this gap is education. And so in agriculture, people are less educated than in non-agriculture. In the United States, that's true in 1850. It's not too much true in the year 2000. The human capital levels are much more comparable. And the distortions that are there, there's just much more ability to move across sectors. And so to the extent that for some reason people are locked into agriculture and agriculture's low productivity, maybe because they can't get education, maybe because of migration costs, maybe because the rural areas aren't very well integrated into urban areas, these could all be distortions. They could also be human capital disparities across sectors.
Sorry, for this one to ask me.
Yeah.
So industry includes mining. You include mining or you exclude?
It's included mining.
Yeah. So I think from what we know of Asia, mining has to be excluded completely because the mining.
I'm sorry, I can't.
No, yeah, sorry. The mining sector should be excluded completely because the mining sector follows basically oil prices.
Yeah, so that's what I kind of looked briefly at whether, so this is kind of getting through this theme, which is you see these general patterns, but then when you come to every country is different. So you always have to interpret these in light of the particular context of the country. So I mentioned like Singapore with agriculture. Mining is a big thing in Malaysia. I didn't exclude it, and maybe that's what I should have done. I did try to look at whether there was some relationship with the mining productivity and with mining shares. Mining shares have gone up here because of the prices. I'm going to assume that all the changes in shares are responses to the price. And I'm not sure how much of that can be explained by mining, but that came much more, that was in the forefront of my mind before thinking about the East Asian financial crisis. But I think that you guys have much more of a knowledge about the particulars in Malaysia than I will. So I'm just kind of presenting the data, and hopefully these generate ideas in your minds. Okay. And did I sufficiently answer your question? Okay. All right. So here in Guy Pissarides, Guy Pissarides say that productivity grows faster in agriculture, medium in manufacturing, and slower in services. That's going to drive relative prices to change over time. That relative prices problem is going to become an issue. They're going to make the numeraire to be manufacturing. They're going to say there's no difference in the factor shares across sectors. So again, you're going to have linear production possibility frontiers. But the intercepts are going to move out at different rates. So that slope of that production possibility frontier is going to change over time. On the demand side, what do they assume? They're going to have homothetic preferences. So they get rid of the problems of luxuries and necessities. They're going to have this low elasticity of substitution. And they're going to have log intertemporal substitution, which is that savings rates are not going to respond to changing interest rates. That's going to lead to a balanced growth path. Investment is going to respond to this changing capital price, basically. Capital is going to be denominated in manufacturing goods, so the price of capital is going to be changing over time, but you're not going to invest more or less because of that changing investment price. So this is sort of the key equations. NI is going to be the share of labor and the share of output in the economy. And the growth rate of shares is going to depend on how fast the growth rate of sector I share. It's going to depend on whether sector I is growing faster than the average in the economy or slower than average in the economy. When it grows faster, the share is going to decline, and because this elasticity substitution is less than 1. If it were greater than 1, it would go the opposite way. Okay? And then what's the average growth rate? It's going to be the share-weighted average of the technology growth rates in the economy. So what this is going to do, which is nicer than Congressman Rubella and Shea, the previous paper, agriculture is going to go faster than the economy. It's the fastest growing sector. It's going to decline over time. Services is going to go slower than the economy because it's the slowest growing sector. It's going to grow over time. Manufacturing, in principle, actually has a hump shape because when a society's agricultural, manufacturing is a fast sector because it's faster than agriculture. So it's going to grow over time. But then as an economy becomes more and more services, manufacturing becomes a slow-growing sector compared to a fast-growing sector compared to a service economy, and it's going to decline over time. So in principle, this could create the hump shape. Quantitatively, it doesn't really do it. So it's another unsatisfying solution. I mentioned the good things. You get this slight hump shape, and you get this constant caloric growth. How do they do this? They have this log intertemporal elasticity, and they have this non-changing numeraire. So they want to avoid Baumol's disease. And you have a production possibility frontier where, just think of two sectors, agriculture and non-agriculture. Agriculture is growing very fast, but you're moving away from agriculture. So that should slow things down. But what they're always going to do is going to say, we want the numeraire to not be GDP per capita, but to be, in this case, they use manufacturing as a numeraire. So they keep a single, even though this production possibility frontier is moving, they're always looking at the intercept, which grows at a constant rate. So it's almost, they've avoided Baumol's disease by kind of like twisting measurement. But that's not really how we measure things in the data. So this is really, it's a little bit of a cheat to getting this balanced growth. And the other thing is I say you get this hump shape in manufacturing, but largely quantitatively it's flat. Okay. The last thing, the growth implications of the generalized model. I think I won't get to I think I'll have to shift some of this stuff to next. We put in the generalized model into a program, okay? And to sort of show how these assumptions fit more generally. I'll give you the takeaway. This is a lot of math, which is I'm not going to be able to get through in a short amount of time. It doesn't really matter. What you can show is that the assumptions in each model are once you make the assumptions in those models, you can write down the aggregate model without thinking about structural transformation. So the reason that they get balanced growth in those models is because structural transformation is irrelevant for growth. So in order to get this balanced growth goal, they've divorced structural transformation from any growth. You can get structural transformation and balanced growth because structural transformation doesn't matter for growth. That, to me, is the most unsatisfying about these solutions in this entire research program, which is the way that they did it is by divorcing for growth. The paper I'm going to talk about tomorrow is going to do the opposite. Which is to say, let's revisit this balanced growth patterns. And in fact, growth isn't balanced. We're going to use Penwell tables data and show you that over development, Calder's facts don't really hold. And so then we have to think about a way, technically it's difficult because you can't use balanced growth path analysis anymore. But you have to think about a way of characterizing the growth dynamics that come from structural transformation. That's what the next paper will be about next class. All right. Then the last thing I think that I'll be able to cover today is the Asamoah and Guerreri paper, which is really just a Rybczynski, if anybody's a trade economist, Rybczynski supply story, which is that you have differences in capital shares across the sectors. You have a capital-intensive sector and a labor-intensive sector. As an economy grows, it accumulates capital. That's going to make, it's kind of like a relative productivity story, but an explanation is capital deepening. It's going to make the capital-intensive sector grow very fast and the labor-intensive sector grow more slowly. This is probably a much better story for thinking about the movement from manufacturing to services, of, prices of manufacturing goods falling, because capital accumulation allows you to be much more productive in making capital goods. That's the story. The demand assumptions are exactly the same as in Ingai and Pissarides. This is the Rybczynski theorem, why I say I like both Daron and Veronica. I'm not sure I could have published this paper as well as they did. Because it's basically the Rybczynski theorem. When a factor of production is increasing, there's a decline in the relative price of the good whose production is relatively intensive in that factor. So if manufacturing is intensive in, by the way, I like this paper for different reasons, but if manufacturing is relatively intensive in capital, capital accumulation is going to lower the price of manufacturing. And with a low elasticity substitution, lower the share of manufacturing. So this is unsatisfying for a few reasons. You're going to get labor consumption and output to grow faster in the capital and slower in the, to grow slower in the capital intensive sector, faster in the non-capital intensive sector. So the resources go to the non-capital intensive sector. I like this idea of moving away from thinking about agriculture, manufacturing, and services to thinking more about production functions. And so they classify industries by capital intensity. It's a very nice paper. They get the constant growth, but they only get it asymptotically. But asymptotically, the reason you get constant growth is because asymptotically, it becomes a single sector economy. You've gotten rid of the two fast-growing sectors, the fast-growing sectors have disappeared from the economy. So it's very easy to get balanced growth in a single sector economy. So in this world, you don't actually get what they wanted anyway, which is balanced growth at the same time as structural transformation. You get structural transformation, then balanced growth. That makes sense? The other thing is that when you look at the classical sectors, there's really not a huge difference in capital share across services and industry. Then finally, you get the problem that I mentioned before, which is you might get constant growth. While structural transformation is happening, you neither get constant growth nor constant factor shares, because you have resources moving from the capital intensive sector to the non-capital intensive sector. So you get capital share declining, for the reasons that I mentioned. So, actually I have a few minutes. You're not raising your hand, okay. I'll move on to a little bit about the quantitative and normative questions in our paper. We asked, these traditional theories, can they actually fit the data quantitatively? Not can they theoretically give you balanced growth, but can they fit the data quantitatively? we want to know how important are these sectoral distortions and relative human capital differences? And can the theory predict structural change in a cross-section of countries? Let me skip that. I'll just show you the fit. This is the data in the United States. And this is the model prediction. The lines are the model predictions. And we use this to point out that the standard theories have problems matching the data. The first thing is the standard theory cannot get this sort of late acceleration in the service share. You see, it's just kind of steadily growing. It can match agriculture relatively well, but because you can't get this late acceleration in the services share, you're also underestimating the hump shape in manufacturing, and especially the deindustrialization process in manufacturing. This is using the United States. That's the best that the model can do. The way the model has to do that is to say that preferences are Leontief, but you still can't get enough of the rise in the services, even if it's Leontief, from the relative price. So you need to have some income effects that come in. Even if you say the relative price of services is rising, and we don't substitute away at all because things are Leontief, you can't get the shares to rise fast enough because the prices don't rise fast enough. So what you need is something to give more demand to services. But the problem with the Stone-Geary preferences is that, remember, those non-homothenicities kick in very early. So it's going to give you a rise in services over here. So what the model wants to do is to say, let's make non-homotheticity not important for services, and let's try to get everything out of relative prices. And it's not strong enough a pattern. What you need is a non-homotheticity in services and manufacturing that kicks in at higher levels of income or is more persistent.
So going back to the preferences side to generate structural change, would so Stone-Geary gives you this endowment or subsistence requirement. Would fixed costs on the production side do the same, or would it be different if we can have fixed costs on production function as well, where you need?
Yeah, and I guess you would have. I mean, it's just difficult. So, like a sectoral fixed cost would be different than it. If you want to think about the actual production unit having a fixed cost, you can still get sort of even growth by changing the number of productive units, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody right at the efficient scale. So, so I don't think that's going to exactly work the same way. But it is a problem with the way the type of non-homotheticity. I got 2 minutes more. And so here, this is what you get. This is the values you get, but this ends up being quite small. This ends up being larger. The non-homotheticity works well for agriculture, not for services. And I mentioned that those are Leontief. This is the fit that we get, the value added versus employment. So again, this is a very standard pattern we're using in the United States here. But the differences between the value added and the employment have to reflect either a distortion or a relative human capital in the sector. And you get, at the middle of the 19th century, very big distortions, and those distortions decline over time, which is interpreting, you can interpret it that whatever was keeping people in agriculture doesn't, it's not the case by the time you get to 2000, things are these distortions are much less in overdevelopment. And in fact, we see this in the cross-section of countries as well. This is the fit in a cross-section of countries. How well does it do? This is the dashed line is sort of a non-parametric fit to the data. This is the model. And again, you sort of get too much action early on in the model and not enough action later. Although it fits okay for the agriculture. So I'll stop with, and I'll continue some of the other fit stuff tomorrow. The two key failures are the delayed acceleration of services and the steep decline of manufacturing, and then the differential patterns of value added and labor shares. And this will motivate, the first thing that I'll do tomorrow is motivate preferences with more nuanced income effects. And this will be like a success in the literature that we are able to fit these patterns much better. Timo Bopart, I don't know why the E disappeared in both of these, that's weird. Timo Bopart has an econometric paper in 2015 where he uses what are called Piggle preferences. Komin, Lashkari, and Mestieri have non-homothetic CES preferences that they introduced. And I like both papers a lot, both in Econometrica. I tend to like this paper a bit more in terms of its usefulness because you can break down, you can use these preferences at very disaggregate levels. So if you want to do an analysis at the industry level, this will do very well in sort of matching the data. So this motivates this literature. And then the second literature is sort of this normative wedge analysis of structural change patterns. Cheremukin et al. Have two papers, one looking at the wedges, the effective wedges in the Soviet Union, and the effective under Stalin, and the effective wedges in China under Mao, and how those have changed. We have some work looking across countries. So I think that's it for today. I'm done with my time. I'll go into, and there's more Malaysia stuff coming up in terms of fit next time, and then we'll cover some of the more normative and policy things that I mentioned.
Any questions?
So I think you're looking at closed economy models, and part
That's
of
right.
the feature of falling manufacturing seems to be manufacturing moving to lower wage economies.
Yeah.
Right? So how do you think about that?
So closed economy models are good for certain things. Closed economy models work actually quite well for a large country like the United States. Closed economy models work actually relatively well for thinking about the movement from agriculture to non-agriculture for poor countries. If you want to look about sub-Saharan African countries, trade is not all that important in thinking about moving from agriculture to non-agriculture. Closed economy models are not the best models for thinking about the East Asian miracles. There's some work by Kei-Mu Yi and Jing Zhang looking at open economy models in Kiminori Matsuyama. And what I mentioned there, and this is particularly important when you go to disaggregate industries, is in structural transformation, like in this Leontief estimation, if you get more productive at something, you move resources out of it. When it comes to a particular industry, it's clear that if you become much more productive in this industry and that industry is tradable, you move resources into that industry. It's exactly the opposite thing. So that's why an open economy model looks like a model with an elasticity substitution that's greater than 1. So it's important, open economy models are for thinking about that. On the other hand, let me go to remarkably, for a lot of questions, this is for tomorrow, but here's the fit for a number of different countries. This is the Stone-Geary, and the Stone-Geary is not a good fit. So just focus on the non-homothetic CES. Does reasonably well in hitting the patterns, even thinking about a closed economy. So the way I kind of think about this is like the benchmark to start with is a closed economy model. And then you might say, oh, Japan seems to be above what we would predict. Is that due to imports and exports? And that's kind of how I've thought about things when I look at these patterns. So again, the sort of closed economy model will hit the general pattern. And you have a lot of variation around the data. And that's where I think that the open economy stuff matters a lot more.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, so you talked a lot about a few times you mentioned the acceleration in services at higher income. What about?
I apologize to you. I'm losing my hearing. So
Okay,
you have to speak up or I won't.
Yes, and I said, you mentioned a couple of times the acceleration of services at higher income level. So what about cases where you get the hump in manufacturing at lower income levels?
This is a premature deindustrialization. So that's, like I said, that doesn't seem to be relevant at all for Malaysia. We'll talk about that tomorrow. Tomorrow.
Okay.
I'll talk about it. So I won't steal thunder from tomorrow. But it doesn't seem to be an issue for Malaysia or other East Asian countries.
One is like, how do the models perform in that? Are we able to predict some of those?
Yeah, so it does. Yeah, so I can show you. Maybe okay.
Sorry, guys.
Here's Korea, the Philippines. Here's some countries where you say there's been premature deindustrialization. It's a little bit above trend here, a little bit below trend here in Colombia, in Mexico. This is from a co-author, is Marty Mestieri, who's also a friend, who provided me with these pictures. But one of the things I dislike is, for me, green is always agriculture, so it makes sense. And then industry is blue, because it's like blue collar, and then we'll make red services. But Marty changes it. So anyway, this is, let's see, I think I just screwed up the thing. So here's the industry. Here's the industry. So, it doesn't seem to be too off in terms of the model and the data in industry. And this is not this is using the elasticities for a common set of elasticities. What's true is that some countries produce more manufacturing than others. Is that due to their productivity levels? Probably. Or their trade patterns? Probably. What ends up happening is that gets worked into the preferences in this story. But in terms of the dynamics, it sort of matches up pretty well. That makes sense.
And then on this, you just to share the Malaysian context a little bit. So if you look at the Malaysian literature, some authors actually do argue that Malaysia underwent premature deindustrialization. And the reason they actually said that is because employment started to decrease even though output and income were increasing. So that is.
So you're saying from the employment perspective, they consider premature deindustrialization.
Yeah, yeah, and it's also worth noting that these same authors say that it's because of the affirmative action policies. So there are some biases.
Is it because of what?
Because of the affirmative action.
Affirmative
policy.
action.
So the same authors who say that Malaysia underwent premature deindustrialization.
That's for ethnic Malays?
Yeah.
Is that the affirmative action?
Yeah, so just to point out that there is that literature out there, and in my own analysis, Malaysia did undergo deindustrialization, but whether or not it's premature, I think.
Yeah, deindustrialization shows up in the labor numbers that I presented. Whether it's premature or not, it doesn't seem to be in terms of, here's a problem with it. Premature has like a normative connotation without any framework for really thinking about the normative aspects of it.
But like you said, maybe it's still a bit unclear, like exactly this is what I was thinking about the Malaysian context, but maybe it was incorrectly placed in the literature from my perspective, but somehow I was thinking people label them premature in deindustrialization because the kind of service sector jobs that you observe people moving into say here now in Malaysia, are not the kind of service sector jobs that people are thinking that high income economy individuals are finally moving into. So that they are moving into non-tradable, low-end kind of services where productivity enhancements are kind of restricted relative to the industrial sector. So it's kind of hitting a dead end in terms of, what kind of productive possibilities are there for these people who are moving out in terms of employment from industry into services where they are,
Yeah, there seems to be, I would say, when I've looked at the data, I mean, look, you get, like I said, I know structural transformation, but you guys know much more about what's going on in Malaysia. It seems to be something unusual about the service sector rather than the manufacturing sector. Although, again, it could be, maybe for tomorrow, I'll drop the mining and I can show you what it looks like without mining.
Or I can share my paper with you and you can have a look at that.
Yeah.
So, thanks a lot, everyone, for coming. We just running a little bit out of time, but I would just give a few minutes for online participants if you have any questions. Sorry, I forgot to ask that earlier. So if
the nice part about in-person talks, you can be sure that you actually have an audience. Even online talk, you might just be talking to yourself. You don't know.
Especially when you're teaching.
So I guess we'll wrap up the discussion here. For all the in-person participants, we have refreshments outside, which will give us more time to chat with Professor Kabowski as well. So I look forward to having you here tomorrow. At 11 for the seminar. Before leaving, please, on your screens, you see a survey QR code. Please fill up that. This helps us to improve and maintain our the quality of our engagements. So please, at the back, for the people in person here, at the back of the screen, we have this QR code. Please fill in a very short survey. And for the people online, they can also view it on their screens. So thank you everyone again. Hoping to see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Have you ever heard the story of, you know who Walter Oy is?
Walter Oy? Yeah.
He's a Rochester guy. And Walter was blind.
Yeah.
And there's a story about Rochester used to be with a very central